Have you ever moved into a neighborhood that seemed to be crawling with creepy neighbors? Or stayed awake all night because something in your gut told you someone was watching your house? If you've ever enjoyed creepy neighbor horror stories, then these upcoming stories will definitely give you the chills. And make sure you watch until the very end of this video for something that will really send shivers down your spine. This happened when I was 22 and I lived in Ohio. I was staying together with some buddies of mine, but things kind of got messy when they started coming home with other friends and literally bringing the party home with them. I knew I wouldn't be able to cope with that for very long, so I started looking for an apartment in a neighborhood around the school. Luckily, the first day I checked on the house listings, I saw something I liked. I couldn't believe it. It was a room in a house that this old couple owned, and so I went for it. But that was a big mistake. A few days after I moved in, I noticed that a window in the next house directly faced my room's window. I kind of wasn't surprised because all the houses on the street had the same architecture. But what really began to creep me out was that whenever I looked out, a boy was standing at that window, wearing a hospital gown and staring directly at me. He was thick-set, probably early to mid-teens, but there was always this dark, cold look in his eyes. The first few days I would give a friendly wave, but that was always met by a stone-cold stare, so I just stopped altogether. At first I just dismissed it as nothing serious, but it persisted. Then one night, things got really out of hand. I came home to find both the kid and his dad standing at the window. Both had the same cold look in their eyes, and they were looking at me. My hair was standing on the back of my neck. My blood was running cold. I sat back on my bed and tried to figure out what was going on. All I knew was that I didn't like the feeling I was getting. After about 20 minutes of this, I stood up to check, and to my shock, they were still there. It didn't look like they'd even budged an inch. It seemed to me like they were obsessed with something about my room specifically. But how wrong was I? Because a few moments later, there was a loud banging on my door. My heart almost exploded. Instinctively, I rushed to my window and looked out. They weren't there. The pounding on my door continued. Everything in me knew I was in trouble. I rarely had visitors, and I really doubted that anyone would just simply walk past the owners of the house, then walk past their adult son, who was also living there, who acted as a kind of caretaker, and just walk straight to my room. I didn't know what was going on. My heart was racing. I quickly scanned my room for anything I could use to defend myself in the case of an attack. There was nothing. Nothing at all. So I picked up my acoustic guitar and headed for the door. I hooked the door from behind and opened it slightly, and what I saw made my heart stop for a second. Standing at the door was the man from the next house. For a minute, I was really puzzled. I asked him what he wanted, and he said he was inviting me over for dinner that night. It sounded more like an order than a request. I told him I was busy and I wouldn't be able to make it. But then he asked me not to do something that I would regret later. Without wasting another second, I shut the door, gathered some stuff, and went over to sleep at my friend's house. That might have been the best decision I've ever made in my life, because when I returned the next morning, I found my lock was broken, and my room looked like a war zone. I looked through the window, and I could still see the boy. Same expression as always. Obviously, I'd had enough. I moved in with a friend the same day. I didn't even tell the caretaker or the house owners. I just left. But what struck me the most was that I checked for house listings that same evening, and that house was listed. My friend suggested that it might have been just a weird business model, but something keeps telling me that there was a lot more to it. When I first started working in Alaska as a single lady a couple of years ago, I had a really creepy neighbor. His name was Jim, and he worked in a nightclub. I didn't really get to see much of him because of the contrasting nature of our jobs. But whenever we did run into each other, there was just something about him that didn't sit right. I couldn't tell exactly what it was. I just didn't trust him. Then one day, it all began to play out, and it would be an understatement to say that I had my fears confirmed. It was a Sunday afternoon when I heard someone knocking hastily at my door. When I got to the door, it was Jim. Instantly, I became apprehensive. He looked disheveled and smelled of alcohol. Whatever he was here for, I knew it was no good, and I was not wrong. Jim handed me a plastic bag saying it was a gift for me. I politely told him I really was not interested in any presents from him. But he said, "That's because you don't know what's in the bag." He put the bag down, opened it, and started removing its contents. He brought out 3 dresses like the kinds girls wear to his clubs, I guess. Immediately, the alarms went off in my head. I knew he didn't buy those clothes, and I was certain there was a lot more to it. Whatever it was, I didn't want any part of it. Once again, he tried to persuade me into taking gifts from him, but I firmly refused, and finally he just gave up. He was clearly irritated, and I saw his face was turning red. Then he asked me what made me feel I was so special. I knew there were no other neighbors around, and I really did not want to get into a confrontation with this guy. The moment he left, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. He had gone, but that wasn't all. 2 days later, when I was at work, I got a call from the police, and they were asking me for an interview. A billion thoughts crossed my mind. I told them when I would be home, and they said they would send some officers to my house. I was not prepared for the outcome. The officers arrived at my house and asked if I knew Jim, and if he was my brother. I told them Jim was my neighbor, and we weren't related in any way. I pointed to where he lived, and after a few questions, they went over to check it out. I wasn't surprised when they found several illegal items in his house, including some things that belonged to some people who lived in the neighborhood. Before the officers left, they explained to me that Jim had gotten into a deal where he used my surname as his, gave my house address as his, and put my name as his next of kin. On top of it all, he had been on the run since last Sunday, and he was wanted in connection to the disappearance of some girls who had visited his club. A knot tightened in my stomach. I immediately felt sick. The officers asked if I knew anything about it, and I told them what had transpired between Jim and me 2 days earlier. They thanked me, and then they left. I kept following the news after that, but I heard nothing about the girls. Jim was arrested a few weeks later in Louisiana. Before I moved out of the neighborhood, a much more decent tenant had taken Jim's house, but whenever the door opened, the thought of Jim came rushing in. When I lived in North Fitzroy, Melbourne, sometime in 2007, I had an experience with a creepy neighbor, and ever since, it stuck to my mind like glue. It was a lovely street. Everyone knew and trusted everyone else. Until a neighbor brought his dad to stay over at his house while he was away with his family on vacation or something. Then everything changed, and pretty quickly too. I couldn't have been the only one who was suspicious of this guy. He was somewhere in his 50s, I think. Before long, word had got on the street that he was a very dangerous guy. Within the first 3 weeks of his arrival, a few neighbors began to complain about the guy. He had been found trespassing on other people's properties without a good excuse, and this raised a lot of suspicion. But it was going to be my turn next. In the middle of the night, when I least expected it. It was a really cold winter night, and I was awakened by strange noises coming from the front door, which wasn't far from my room's window when I was looking at the building from outside. It was about 2 a.m. I picked up my flashlight and went to the front door. With each step I took, my heart was pounding harder. I walked to the door, and it was then I realized that someone was trying to pick the lock and break into my house. With all the courage I could muster, I asked who was there, and I heard his voice asking me to open up and let him in. But there was no way I was going to open the door and let this guy in. I asked what he wanted, and he pleaded to spend the night on my couch because it was cold at his place and the lights were out. That didn't even make sense to me because the lights were out at my place too. I was fed up. I asked him to leave, otherwise I'd call the neighbors, and he said that that would not be necessary and that he was leaving. I heard his footsteps leaving the porch, and I just breathed a sigh of relief. But it wasn't over yet. Just a few seconds later, I heard the crashing sounds of shattering glass. It was coming from my room. I was scared before, but now I was frozen. A million thoughts of all the possibilities came rushing into my mind. But before I could process any of them, I pulled out the key behind the front door and raced to my room. There he was, standing with a menacing smile on his face. For the first time since I started living there, I realized I should have had burglar-proof windows. He was still smiling, and he said he didn't want to bother me. He just wanted to sleep on my couch for the night. It was obvious he had darker plans, and I knew it. Then I did what I consider today to be the bravest move I've ever made in my life. I screamed at the top of my voice. He was thrown off balance for a minute, and in a blind panic, he ran past me out of my room. Quickly, I seized the opportunity and shut my door and turned the key in the lock. I was crying. Waves of terror washed over me, but that was my moment of miracle. All around my house, flashlights were coming from all directions, and my neighbors were calling my name as they came running. At this point, I could hear the guy trying to force open the front door. He rushed back to my room and tried to get in, but luckily I had locked it, right? He was pounding on it, and then he ran off again. He found his way to the back door, but he only ran into the hands of my neighbors. I guess someone must have called the police, because soon afterwards I started seeing the blue and red lights pouring through my broken window. I was so shaken I couldn't bring myself to stop crying. Later, I was informed that when the police searched the guy, they found a syringe in his pocket, and at my door, he had left a little bag which contained some dangerous chemicals. All I have to say is I'm just glad that I never found out what he was going to use them for.